The last rays of sunset painted the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge in shades of purple and gold, casting long shadows from the weathered buildings that lined both sides of the thoroughfare. Wind swept down from the distant mountains, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another cold night. Martha Caldwell stood at the narrow window of her room behind the Silver Dollar Saloon, watching as the town prepared for evening, shopkeepers pulling down their awnings, horses being led to the livery stable, men beginning their nightly pilgrimage to the gambling tables and whiskey bottles that awaited them just beyond the thin wall at her back. She could hear the familiar sounds beginning to stir in the saloon, the scrape of chair legs against wooden floors, the clink of glasses, the low rumble of masculine voices that would soon rise to a roar as the night wore on and the liquor flowed more freely. Once, those sounds had been the backdrop to her life, when she'd stood on that small stage in her emerald dress, her voice rising above the chaos to bring a moment of beauty to men starved for any reminder of gentler things. But that was before Samuel, before the night that changed everything. Martha pressed her palm against the cool glass, her wedding ring catching the dying light. 6 months had passed since they'd found Samuel face down in the alley behind the saloon, a bullet in his back and his pockets turned out, empty of the modest winnings he'd collected at the faro table that night. The sheriff had made a show of investigating, questioning a few of the usual suspects, but Martha knew the truth. Nobody cared much about the death of a gambler, especially one who'd been foolish enough to marry the saloon's former songbird. The whispers had started before Samuel's body was even cold. She heard them in the mercantile when she went to buy flour, saw them in the sideways glances of the church women who crossed the street rather than pass her on the boardwalk. The saloon widow, they called her, as if those 3 words contained everything anyone needed to know about Martha Caldwell, as if her past in sequins and face paint had somehow invited the violence that took her husband, as if she belonged to that world of sin and shadow, forever marked by it no matter how far she tried to run. A gust of wind rattled the window frame, and Martha shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The room was small but clean. She'd seen to that, scrubbing every surface until her hands were raw, as if she could wash away the stain of gossip with lye soap and determination. The narrow bed with its quilt made by her own mother, the small table with 2 chairs. She hadn't been able to bring herself to remove the second one. The trunk that held her few possessions. It wasn't much, but it was hers, paid for with the meager savings Samuel had hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She turned from the window and lit the oil lamp, adjusting the wick until a steady glow pushed back the gathering darkness. Outside, she could hear boots on the boardwalk, spurs jingling as cowboys arrived for their evening revelry. Once, she might have been preparing to entertain them, warming up her voice with scales, applying rouge to her cheeks. Now, she simply existed in this liminal space, neither part of the saloon's world nor accepted by the respectable folk of Cedar Ridge. The mountains beyond town were already lost in shadow, their peaks invisible against the darkening sky. Martha had often wondered what lay beyond those mountains, in places where nobody knew her name or her history. But wondering was a luxury she couldn't afford. The money Samuel had saved would last perhaps another month if she was careful. And then, well, she tried not to think about what came after that. A burst of laughter from the saloon made her flinch. She recognized the voice. Jack Morrison, the owner of the Silver Dollar, who'd been only too happy to rent her this back room at an inflated price, knowing she had nowhere else to go. He'd offered her other arrangements too, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. But she'd refused. There were some lines she wouldn't cross, some remnants of dignity she clung to even as the rest of her world crumbled. The wind picked up again, howling through the gaps in the building's construction like the voices of the dead. Martha moved to the door, checking the lock as she did every night, running her fingers over the solid iron bolt that stood between her and the world outside. It had become a ritual, this checking and double-checking, as if by securing this simple barrier she could keep out more than just the drunken cowboys and traveling men who might remember her from her performing days. She thought of Samuel's laugh, The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. How he'd held her hand that first night she'd sung just for him, after the saloon had closed and it was just the two of them in the empty room. He'd been different from the others, quieter, more thoughtful, with gentle hands that had never known hard labor. A dreamer, her mother would have called him, and perhaps that's what had gotten him killed in the end. Dreamers didn't last long in places like Cedar Ridge. The town itself seemed to huddle against the approaching night. Its handful of streets and false-fronted buildings, a tiny island of civilization in an ocean of wilderness. To the east lay the Badlands, harsh and unforgiving territory where outlaws and renegades made their camps. To the west, the mountains rose like a wall, their passes treacherous even in good weather. And all around, the vast expanse of rangeland stretched to the horizon, dotted with cattle and the occasional homestead of those brave or foolish enough to try their hand at taming this wild country. Martha had come to Cedar Ridge 3 years ago with a traveling show, her voice her only asset and her past a carefully guarded secret. She'd planned to move on after a few weeks, as always. But then she'd met Samuel, and for the first time in her life, she'd allowed herself to believe in the possibility of settling down, of having something permanent and real. Now he was gone, and she was trapped by the very respectability she'd tried so hard to achieve. Too proper for the saloon, too tainted for the town. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its mournful cry echoing across the empty land. Martha shivered again, though the room wasn't truly cold yet. Winter was coming. She could feel it in the bite of the wind, see it in the way the old-timers checked their wood piles and the ranchers drove their herds to lower pastures. Soon the snow would come, sealing the passes and turning Cedar Ridge into an even smaller island, cut off from the outside world until spring. She moved away from the door, settling into the chair by the table. A piece of needlework lay there, abandoned days ago when her hands had been too shaky to hold the needle steady. It was meant to be a pillowcase, something useful and practical, the kind of thing a respectable widow might occupy herself with. But even this simple task seemed beyond her now, her mind too full of worries and memories to focus on the tiny, precise stitches. Through the thin walls, she could hear the saloon warming to its nightly fever pitch. Someone was playing the piano, badly, and voices rose in a ragged chorus of some half-remembered song. Once, she would have been in the center of it all, her clear soprano cutting through the smoke and noise like a blade of pure sound. Men had traveled miles to hear her sing, had thrown silver dollars at her feet, and proposed marriage with drunken sincerity. She'd thought herself above it all then, untouchable in her spotlight, protected by her talent and her carefully maintained distance. But she'd learned the hard way that no amount of distance could protect you in a place like this. The frontier didn't care about your dreams or your dignity. It took what it wanted and left you to pick up the pieces, if you were lucky enough to survive at all. Martha stood abruptly, pacing the small room like a caged animal. 4 steps to the window, 4 steps back to the door. She'd worn a path in the floor these past months, her restless feet seeking some escape that didn't exist. The walls seemed to press closer with each passing day, the room shrinking until she felt she might suffocate in its confines. She paused at the window again, looking out at the town she'd once thought might be home. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, cold and distant in the vast western sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the mountains and the Badlands, there were places where a woman might start over, where the past didn't cling like trail dust to everything you touched. But those places might as well be on the moon for all the chance she had of reaching them. The lock on her door seemed to mock her as she checked it one final time before retiring to bed. The saloon widow locked her door, she whispered to herself, the words bitter on her tongue. It had become her nightly prayer, her declaration of independence from a world that had taken everything from her. She would not let them in, not the leering cowboys, not the judgmental townswomen, not even the well-meaning few who might offer genuine help. She would lock her door against all of it, creating her own small fortress in this back room, even if it meant locking herself in as surely as she locked others out. The wind continued its mournful song as Martha extinguished the lamp and lay down fully clothed on the narrow bed. Tomorrow would bring the same struggles, the same whispers, the same locked door. But tonight, at least, she was safe in her solitude, protected by iron bolt and fierce determination from a world that had already taken too much. The saloon widow had locked her door, and nothing, not loneliness, not hunger, not even the cruel whispers of Cedar Ridge, would make her open it again. Or so she told herself. As the darkness closed in and the sound of revelry continued through the night, a reminder of the life she'd lost and the uncertain future that awaited her when her money ran out and her options dwindled to nothing. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the mountains, promising storms to come. The wagon wheels creaked in protest as Jacob McKenna guided his team down the rutted main street of Cedar Ridge. Dust swirled around the horses' hooves, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that seemed to be the permanent condition of this frontier town. He'd made this journey from his ranch in the mountains countless times over the years, but today felt different. Storm clouds were building over the peaks behind him, dark and ominous, promising the first real blizzard of the season. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop outside Henderson's general store, his movements careful and deliberate. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw pulled tight in the cold air, a permanent reminder of the day his life had changed forever. 3 years had passed since the range war that had claimed his younger brother Thomas, but the memory remained as fresh as the morning it happened. Some wounds, he'd learned, never truly healed. He climbed down from the wagon seat, his boots hitting the packed earth with a solid thud. At 32, Jacob cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life under the open sky. His dark hair, touched with premature gray at the temples, fell past his collar, and his eyes held the wary alertness of someone who'd learned not to turn his back on anyone. The town was busier than usual, folks hurrying to complete their business before the storm hit. Jacob nodded to a few familiar faces, but didn't stop to talk. He'd cultivated his reputation as a loner carefully over the years, and most people in Cedar Ridge knew better than to engage him in idle conversation. It was better this way, safer for everyone involved. Inside the general store, he methodically filled his order: flour, coffee, salt, ammunition for his rifle, and other supplies that would see him through what promised to be a long, hard winter. Old Henderson tallied the goods without comment, though Jacob could feel the man's curious gaze. Everyone wondered about the rancher who lived alone up in the high country, who came to town only when absolutely necessary and left as quickly as he could. "Storm's coming," Henderson finally ventured, wrapping Jacob's purchases in brown paper. "Appears so," Jacob replied, counting out payment in worn bills. "Might want to consider staying in town tonight. That road up to your place will be treacherous if the snow starts falling heavy." Jacob merely grunted in response, gathering his supplies. The thought of spending a night in Cedar Ridge, surrounded by people and their prying eyes, made his skin crawl. He'd rather take his chances with the storm. As he loaded the wagon, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. The Silver Dollar Saloon was already doing brisk business, piano music and laughter spilling out through the bat-wing doors. Jacob had never been one for drinking in public places. Too many opportunities for trouble. Too many ghosts that whiskey might awaken. But as he secured the last of his supplies, something caught his eye. A window on the upper floor of the saloon, small and set apart from the main building. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the lamplight, her posture speaking of profound loneliness. Something about the way she held herself, the isolation that seemed to radiate from that solitary figure, struck a chord deep within him. He knew that kind of aloneness, had lived with it every day since Thomas died. "That's the widow Caldwell," a voice said beside him. Jacob turned to find Pete Morrison, the saloon owner's nephew, loading crates onto a nearby wagon. The young man's expression held a mixture of pity and something else, speculation, maybe, or judgment. "Used to sing here before she married that gambler, lives in the back room now." Won't hardly speak to nobody." Jacob said nothing, but his gaze returned to the window. The woman had moved away, leaving only the golden glow of lamplight. He'd heard talk of the saloon singer who'd married beneath her station, then lost her husband to violence. Such stories were common enough in places like Cedar Ridge, where dreams came to die and hope was a luxury few could afford. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow. Jacob could read the signs as clearly as any written warning. This would be no ordinary storm. The temperature was dropping fast, and the clouds rolling in from the north had that heavy, purposeful look that promised a genuine blizzard. He should leave now. Try to make it home before the worst of it hit, but something held him in place. Maybe it was the memory of that solitary figure in the window, or maybe it was his own reluctance to face another night alone in his cabin with only ghosts for company. He found himself walking toward the saloon, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Inside, the Silver Dollar was everything he'd expected. Loud, smoky, and filled with men seeking temporary escape from the harsh realities of frontier life. Jacob made his way to the bar, ordering a whiskey he didn't particularly want. The bartender, a thick-set man with scarred knuckles, poured without comment. "Ain't seen you in here before," someone said. Jacob glanced over to find Jack Morrison himself, dressed in a fancy vest that looked out of place among the rough crowd. The saloon owner's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Jacob McKenna, isn't it? The rancher from up Mountain Way?" Jacob nodded, taking a sip of his whiskey. It burned going down. Cheap rotgut that would leave a man with a powerful headache come morning. "Heard you had some trouble up your way a few years back." Morrison continued, his tone carefully casual. Something about a disagreement over water rights. The scar on Jacob's face seemed to throb at the memory. "It's done with," he said shortly. Morrison's smile widened. Of course, just making conversation. Though I did hear Ben Harlan's been asking around about you lately. Seems he's still holding a grudge about how things ended." Jacob's hand tightened on his glass. Ben Harlan, the man who'd orchestrated the range war, who'd sent hired guns to drive Jacob and Thomas off their land, the man whose bullet had left the scar on Jacob's face, though it was meant for his heart. The man who'd shot Thomas in the back when the boy was barely 18, leaving him to die in Jacob's arms while Harlan's men laughed. "Like I said," Jacob repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's done with." Morrison shrugged, moving away to tend to other customers. But the damage was done. The memories Jacob had worked so hard to bury were stirring, awakened by the mention of Harlan's name. He downed the rest of his whiskey in one burning gulp and stood to leave. That's when he heard it, a voice, faint but clear, drifting through the noise of the saloon. Someone was singing, not the bawdy songs usually heard in such places, but something achingly beautiful and sad. The voice was coming from somewhere behind the main room, muffled by walls, but still powerful enough to cut through the chaos, without conscious thought. Jacob found himself moving toward the sound. A narrow hallway led to the back of the building, and at its end, a door stood slightly ajar. The singing was clearer here, a woman's voice rising and falling in a melody that spoke of loss and longing. He stood frozen, transported by the pure beauty of it, until the song ended and silence fell. Through the crack in the door, he glimpsed a small, shabby room. The woman from the window sat at a table, her head bowed, unaware of his presence. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple knot. Her dress was plain but clean, and her hands, clasped before her on the table, trembled slightly. Jacob backed away, feeling like an intruder. But as he turned to go, the floor creaked beneath his boot. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes, green as spring grass, wide with alarm. "Who's there?" she called, rising from her chair. Jacob hesitated, then stepped into view. "My apologies, ma'am. I heard singing and I didn't mean to intrude." She stared at him for a long moment, taking in his rough appearance, the scar, the wariness in his stance. Then something in her expression shifted. hardening. "The show's over, mister. Has been for 6 months now. If you're looking for entertainment, you'll find it in the main room." "That's not why Jacob began, but she was already moving to close the door. "Please leave," she said, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "I don't receive visitors." The door shut firmly in his face, followed by the sound of a bolt sliding home. Jacob stood in the dim hallway, feeling foolish and strangely bereft. He'd scared her, he realized. A strange man appearing at her door. Of course she'd been frightened. He of all people should understand the need for walls, for barriers against a world that had proved itself cruel. He made his way back through the saloon and out into the street. The first snowflakes were beginning to fall, fat and heavy, already starting to accumulate on the wooden sidewalks. His wagon sat where he'd left it, the horses stamping nervously as the wind picked up. Jacob climbed onto the seat and took up the reins, but hesitated before setting off. The road to his ranch would be dangerous in this weather, possibly impassable if he waited much longer. But the image of that woman, Martha Caldwell, the widow, stayed with him. The loneliness in her eyes, the beauty of her voice, the way she'd shut him out just as he shut out the rest of the world. Thunder rumbled overhead, unusual for a snowstorm, and the wind howled between the buildings like a living thing. Jacob made his decision. He'd find lodging in town tonight, wait out the worst of the storm. It was the practical choice, he told himself, though he knew there was more to it than that. As he guided the wagon toward the livery stable, snow began falling in earnest, thick curtains of white that obscured the mountains and turned the familiar streets strange and dreamlike. Behind him, in her small room, Martha Caldwell sat alone, unaware that the knock that would shatter every rule she'd made for herself was only hours away. The storm was coming, bringing with it changes neither of them could foresee. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond town, Ben Harlan's men were riding, following rumors and old grudges toward a reckoning 3 years in the making. The blizzard struck Cedar Ridge with the fury of a wounded beast. By midnight, the wind screamed through the streets, driving snow horizontally past Martha's window in sheets so thick she could no longer see the buildings across the way. The temperature had plummeted, and even with her small stove burning, ice formed on the inside of the glass panes. She pulled her heaviest shawl around her shoulders and tried to ignore the way the entire building seemed to shake with each gust. The saloon below had emptied hours ago, even the most dedicated drinkers driven home by the storm's intensity. The unusual silence should have been peaceful, but instead it felt ominous, as if the world outside had vanished entirely, leaving her alone in this small room while nature raged against the walls. She'd banked the stove carefully, rationing her meager supply of wood, but at this rate, it wouldn't last through the night. Then came the knock, 3 solid raps that cut through the howling wind. Martha froze, her heart suddenly pounding. No one would be out in this weather, not unless they were desperate or dangerous. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and she heard a voice, though the words were torn away by the storm. She crept to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. "Please," she heard, the voice deep and strained. "I need shelter. My room at the boarding house. The roof caved in." Martha recognized the voice with a start. It was the man from earlier, the scarred rancher who'd appeared in her doorway like some figure from a frontier legend. Her first instinct was to ignore him, to maintain the wall she'd built between herself and the world. But another gust of wind shook the building, and she heard him cough, a harsh, painful sound that spoke of too long in the cold. "Go away," she called through the door. "The hotel?" "Hotel's full," he interrupted, his voice weaker now. "Everywhere's full or shut tight. Please, ma'am, I won't harm you. Just need to get warm." Martha's hands trembled as she reached for the bolt. Every lesson life had taught her screamed against opening that door. But the memory of Samuel's voice echoed in her mind. "We've got to help each other out here. Martha, it's the only way any of us survive." Before she could change her mind, she slid the bolt back and opened the door a crack. Jacob McKenna stood in the narrow hallway, covered in snow, his face pale beneath the scar. Ice crystals clung to his eyebrows and beard, and his lips had a bluish tinge that sent alarm through her. He was shivering violently, his coat soaked through. "Just for the storm," he said through chattering teeth. "I'll sit by the door. Won't trouble you." Martha made her decision. She opened the door wider, stepping back to let him in. "Quickly," she said. "You're letting the heat out." He stumbled inside, and she shut the door behind him, sliding the bolt back into place. In the small room, he seemed even larger, a snow-covered giant dripping melting ice onto her clean floor. He started to sink down by the door as promised, but Martha saw the way his legs shook. "Don't be foolish," she said, her practical nature overcoming her fear. "Get that wet coat off and sit by the stove. You'll catch your death otherwise." He looked at her with surprise but obeyed, hanging his soaked coat on a peg by the door. Underneath, his shirt was damp with sweat and melted snow. Martha busied herself putting water on to heat, trying not to notice the way he moved. Careful, controlled, like a man who'd learned to be always ready for trouble. "Thank you," he said simply, holding his hands out to the stove's warmth. Martha didn't reply immediately, pouring hot water into 2 cups and adding precious tea leaves. She handed him 1 cup, then retreated to sit on the bed, as far from him as the small room allowed. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm's fury and the crackle of wood in the stove. "I'm sorry about earlier," Jacob finally said. "I shouldn't have intruded." "Why did you?" Martha asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. He was quiet for a moment, staring into his tea. "I heard you singing. It reminded me of better times." "I don't sing anymore," she said firmly. "That's a shame. You have a beautiful voice." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mr. McKenna, isn't it? I know who you are. Everyone in town knows about the rancher who lives alone up in the mountains, the one who lost his brother in that range war." His jaw tightened, the scar standing out white against his wind-burned skin. "Then you know I understand something about loss." The words hung between them, creating an unexpected bridge. Martha found herself studying him more closely. Despite his intimidating size and the violence written in his scar, there was something gentle about his eyes, a sadness that matched her own. "Your husband," he said carefully. "I heard what happened. I'm sorry." "Everyone heard what happened," Martha replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "The saloon singer who married a gambler and got what she deserved. That's what they say, isn't it? People say a lot of things. Doesn't make them true." She looked at him sharply, but found no judgment in his expression. Outside, something crashed, probably a sign torn loose by the wind. They both tensed, then relaxed as the sound wasn't repeated. "Why aren't you at your ranch?" Martha asked, needing to fill the silence. "Came for supplies. Didn't expect the storm to hit this hard, this fast." He grimaced. "Truth is, I should have headed back hours ago, but I heard Morrison mention Ben Harlan's been asking about me, and, well, it rattled me more than I care to admit." "Harlan, he's the one who killed your brother?" Jacob nodded slowly. "Shot him in the back during what he called a water rights dispute. Really, he wanted our land, and we were in the way. The law didn't care much. Harlan had money, influence. We were just small ranchers trying to hold on to what was ours." Martha understood that kind of injustice all too well. The sheriff barely investigated Samuel's death. Said it was probably just a robbery gone wrong, even though Samuel never carried much money. I think someone wanted him dead, but I'll never be able to prove it." "Why would someone want to kill your husband?" She hesitated, then found herself telling this stranger what she'd never told anyone. Samuel had been asking questions about some of the town's business dealings. He was smart, good with numbers. He'd noticed things, shipments that didn't match receipts, money moving through the saloon that couldn't be accounted for by liquor sales. I told him to leave it alone. But he couldn't," Jacob finished. "Some men can't turn away from the truth, even when it's dangerous. And some women can't stop singing, even when it marks them as improper," Martha added softly. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the storm creating a strange sense of intimacy in the small room. Martha found herself relaxing slightly, the constant vigilance she'd maintained for months easing just a fraction. Jacob seemed content to simply sit, warming himself, making no demands. "I should check the wood supply," she said eventually, noticing the stove was burning lower. "How much do you have?" "Maybe enough for another hour or two. I wasn't expecting—" She gestured helplessly at the storm. Jacob stood immediately. "There's a wood pile behind the saloon. I saw it earlier. I'll get some." "You can't go back out in that," Martha protested. "You just got warm." "I've been in worse," he said, already reaching for his still damp coat. "Besides, we'll both freeze if that stove goes out." Before she could argue further, he'd unbolted the door and disappeared into the hallway. Martha stood there, uncertain, listening to the storm and wondering at her own foolishness. She'd let a strange man into her room, had told him secrets she'd kept buried for months. The careful walls she'd built were crumbling, and she didn't know whether to shore them up or let them fall. Long minutes passed before she heard footsteps in the hall. The door burst open, and Jacob stumbled in, his arms full of split wood, more snow coating him from head to foot. He kicked the door shut and dumped the wood by the stove, breathing hard. "Temperatures dropping fast," he said, shaking snow from his hair. "This is turning into one of the worst storms I've seen." Martha helped him out of his coat again, noting with alarm that his hands were nearly numb with cold. Without thinking, she took them between her own, rubbing briskly to restore circulation. He went very still at her touch, and she realized what she was doing, how improper it must seem. But she didn't let go. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied, his voice rough. "It's what decent people do, help each other." Their eyes met and held, something shifting in the air between them. Martha became acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation, alone together in her room. The door bolted against the world, but she also felt, for the first time in months, not alone. This scarred, quiet man understood loss and injustice. He didn't look at her with pity or speculation, but with recognition, one wounded soul acknowledging another. She released his hands and stepped back, the moment breaking. "You should rest," she said. "Take the chair. I'll sit on the bed." "I can't take your chair, ma'am. The floor is fine." "Don't be stubborn. Mr. McKenna, you just saved us from freezing. The least I can do is offer you a chair." A small smile tugged at his lips, the first she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger despite the scar. "My friends call me Jacob," he said. "I don't have friends anymore," Martha replied automatically, then softened. "But you can call me Martha." They settled into their respective places, Jacob in the chair, Martha on the bed, as the storm raged on. The stove glowed warmly now, well fed with wood, creating a small haven against the chaos outside. They talked quietly through the night, sharing carefully edited stories of their pasts, finding unexpected common ground in their isolation and grief. As dawn approached, the wind finally began to die down, though snow still fell heavily. Martha dozed fitfully, waking to find Jacob keeping watch, feeding the stove, ensuring their survival through the brutal night. When she offered to take a turn, he simply shook his head. "I'm used to keeping watch," he said quietly. "Sleep, you're safe." And strangest of all, she believed him. For the first time since Samuel's death, Martha Caldwell slept deeply, trusting this unlikely guardian who'd knocked on her door in the storm. The rules she'd made for herself, the walls, the isolation, the locked door, seemed less important than the human connection forged in the midst of the blizzard. Outside, Cedar Ridge lay buried under feet of snow, transformed into an alien landscape. But inside the small room behind the saloon, two broken people had found, if not healing, at least a moment's respite from their loneliness. It was a beginning, though neither could guess where it might lead. The morning light filtering through the frosted window was weak and gray, barely penetrating the heavy clouds that still clung to the sky. Martha woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar presence in her room. Jacob sat by the stove, his large frame still despite what must have been an uncomfortable night in the wooden chair. He'd kept the fire burning steady. She realized, sacrificing his own comfort to ensure their warmth. "Good morning," he said quietly when he noticed her stirring. His voice was hoarse with fatigue, and the shadows under his eyes spoke of his sleepless vigil. "You should have woken me," Martha said, sitting up and smoothing her wrinkled dress. "We could have taken turns. You needed the rest more than I did." He stood, stretching carefully, and she heard his joints protest. "Storm's not done yet, but it's eased some. Soon as it's safe, I'll head out, leave you in peace." The thought of returning to her solitude, which had seemed so essential just yesterday, now filled Martha with an unexpected reluctance. "There's no rush," she heard herself say. "At least have something to eat first. I have some bread and preserves." They shared the simple breakfast in companionable silence, the intimacy of the night's conversation giving way to a more cautious dynamic in the daylight. Martha was acutely aware of how this must look, a widow sharing her room with a man who wasn't her husband. But the storm had created its own rules, a temporary suspension of the usual social boundaries. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, needing to fill the silence. "It must be lonely, living up there by yourself." Jacob considered the question, spreading blackberry preserves on a slice of bread with careful movements. "It is," he admitted. "But loneliness and I have made our peace. The land keeps me busy. Cattle don't care much about a man's past, long as he feeds them and keeps the wolves away." "Wolves?" Martha shivered slightly. "They come down from the high country in winter, when game gets scarce. Lost a few calves last year." He paused, then added, "But they're just trying to survive, same as the rest of us." Through the thin walls, they could hear movement in the saloon, someone banging around, probably Morrison checking on his property after the storm. Martha tensed, knowing how quickly gossip would spread if anyone discovered Jacob had spent the night in her room. He noticed her distress. "I can go out the back way," he offered. "No one needs to know I was here." "It doesn't matter," Martha said, though they both knew it did. "People will talk regardless. They always do." A heavy thud from outside made them both look toward the window. Through the frost-covered glass, they could see men moving in the street, shoveling pathways through the deep drifts. The town was beginning to dig itself out, returning to life after the storm's paralysis. "I should see to my supplies," Jacob said, standing. "Make sure everything survived the night." But before he could move toward his coat, they heard footsteps in the hallway, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Martha's blood ran cold. She recognized the heavy tread of Jack Morrison, and with him, others. The knock, when it came, was not polite. "Mrs. Caldwell." Morrison's voice boomed through the door. "Open up. We need to talk." Martha and Jacob exchanged glances. She saw her own understanding reflected in his eyes. Somehow, their night together had been discovered. With trembling hands, she unbolted the door. Morrison stood in the hallway with two other men, Deputy Shaw and Reverend Hutchins, whose pinched face wore an expression of scandalized righteousness. Their eyes went immediately to Jacob, taking in his presence, the rumpled state of them both, the single room. Well, Morrison said, his smile unpleasant. "Looks like our widow found herself some comfort in the storm." "Watch your tongue," Jacob said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "Or what, McKenna?" Deputy Shaw interjected, his hand moving suggestively toward his gun. "You'll shoot up another town. Heard that's your way of solving problems." Martha stepped forward, anger overcoming her fear. "Mr. McKenna sought shelter from the storm. Nothing more. The boarding house roof collapsed. That what he told you?" Morrison laughed. "Funny. The boarding house looks fine to me, though I did wonder why McKenna's wagon was at the livery all night instead of him heading home like he said he would." The trap became clear. They'd been watching, waiting for an opportunity to cause trouble. But why? Martha's mind raced, trying to understand the game being played. The lady's reputation is already compromised, Reverend Hutchins said, his reedy voice dripping with false concern. But this flagrant disregard for propriety cannot be tolerated in a Christian community. Since when is Cedar Ridge a Christian community? Jacob asked. Last I checked, this was a town built on whiskey and cards. Things are changing, Shaw said. Folks want respectability now. Law and order can't have undesirable elements corrupting the place. Martha understood then. This wasn't really about her or Jacob. This was about property, about Morrison wanting her gone so he could reclaim this room. Rent it for more money to the cowboys who would pay premium prices once the cattle drive started again in spring. Maybe it was even bigger than that. Maybe they wanted to push out anyone who didn't fit their vision of what Cedar Ridge should become. What do you want? She asked directly. Morrison's smile widened. Well now, that's simple. You've violated the terms of your rental agreement. No overnight guests, especially not men. I'll need you out by noon. In this weather? Jacob's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Where's she supposed to go? That's not my concern, Morrison replied, though I hear there are establishments in Dodge City that would welcome a woman of her talents. Jacob moved so fast Martha barely saw it. One moment he was standing beside her. The next, he had Morrison pressed against the hallway wall, his forearm across the man's throat. Apologize to the lady, he growled. Shaw went for his gun, but Jacob's free hand caught his wrist. I wouldn't, he said, unless you want to explain to the real sheriff, not your bought and paid for boss, why you drew on an unarmed man defending a woman's honor. For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Morrison gasped. Fine. My apologies. Mrs. Caldwell. But you're still evicted. Noon. Jacob released him, stepping back but keeping himself between Martha and the men. She'll leave when the roads are clear and not before, he said. And if any of you bothers her again, you'll answer to me. Is that a threat, McKenna? Shaw asked, trying to salvage some authority. It's a promise, Jacob replied. The three men retreated, Morrison rubbing his throat and muttering about assault charges. When they were gone, Martha found herself shaking. She sank into the chair, her legs suddenly weak. I'm sorry, Jacob said. I've made things worse for you. No, Martha said firmly. They would have found another excuse. Morrison's been looking for a reason to throw me out for weeks. She looked up at him. Thank you for defending me. No one's done that in a long time. Jacob knelt beside her chair, his expression troubled. Martha, you can't stay here now. They'll make your life miserable, maybe even dangerous. I have nowhere else to go, she admitted. My money's almost gone, and no respectable establishment will rent to the scandalous widow Caldwell. He was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, I have a proposition, not what you're thinking, he added quickly, seeing her expression. I need help at the ranch, someone to cook, keep house. It's honest work. And you'd have your own room, proper quarters. The ranch house is big, too big for just me. Martha stared at him. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a way out of here, he corrected. A chance to start over, away from the gossip and judgment. The mountains don't care about your past. People would assume. Let them assume, Jacob said fiercely. You'll be safe. That's what matters. And I could use the company. These past hours, talking with someone who understands loss, it's reminded me what I've been missing. Martha's mind whirled. It was madness to consider going into the wilderness with a man she'd known for less than a day. But what was the alternative? The streets? Selling herself in some Dodge City parlor house, at least with Jacob. She'd have honest work and a man who'd already proved he'd protect her. The ranch, she said slowly. Tell me more about it. Hope flickered in his eyes as he began to describe his land, the meadows that bloomed with wildflowers in spring, the clear mountain streams, the cabin he'd built with his own hands. As he talked, Martha could see it, a place where the past couldn't reach her, where she could perhaps find some peace. I can't pay much, he warned. But you'd have room and board, and come spring, when I sell the cattle, a fair wage. And we'd observe all proprieties, Martha said. Separate quarters, clear boundaries. Of course, Jacob agreed. I'm not looking for anything but help with the house, and maybe, in time, friendship. Through the window, weak sunlight was breaking through the clouds. The storm was passing, leaving behind a transformed world. Martha thought of the song she'd been humming when Jacob first heard her, about new beginnings and leaving sorrow behind. All right, she said, the words feeling like stepping off a cliff. I'll come. Relief washed over his face. We'll leave as soon as the roads are passable, day after tomorrow. Maybe. That gives you time to pack, settle any affairs here. There's nothing to settle, Martha said. Nothing keeping me here but ghosts. They spent the rest of the day making plans, ignoring the curious faces that peered through her window and the whispers that followed Jacob when he went to check on his wagon. By evening, word had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. The widow Caldwell was leaving with the scarred rancher, heading into the mountains like some character from a dime novel. Martha didn't care. For the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. It might be foolish to trust this man, to venture into the unknown with winter still gripping the land. But foolishness seemed preferable to the slow death of staying in this room, locked away from life. That night, Jacob slept in the livery stable with his horses, maintaining propriety now that the crisis had passed. But before he left, he pressed a small object into Martha's hand, a key. To the ranch house, he explained. So you know you can leave whenever you want. You're not trading one prison for another. After he'd gone, Martha sat by the stove, turning the key over in her hands. It was worn smooth with use, substantial and real. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears. But tonight, she allowed herself to hope that somewhere beyond the mountains, a different life was waiting, one where she could sing again without shame, where the past was just a story told by the fire, where two broken people might find a way to heal. Outside, stars appeared between the breaking clouds, bright and cold in the winter sky. The storm had passed, leaving the world clean and new, and Martha Caldwell, who had locked her door against the world, was finally ready to open it again. The news spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire in dry grass. By the morning of their planned departure, it seemed every soul in town knew that the widow Caldwell was leaving with Jacob McKenna, heading into the mountains to live at his isolated ranch. The gossip ranged from the scandalous to the absurd, each telling more elaborate than the last. Martha tried to ignore the stares as she made her final preparations, purchasing what few supplies she could afford with her remaining money. At Henderson's store, the old proprietor at least had the decency to serve her without comment, though she could feel the weight of judgment from the other customers who suddenly found reasons to linger near the counter. That all, Mrs. Caldwell? Henderson asked, wrapping her meager purchases. Yes, thank you. She counted out the coins carefully, aware that this was the last of Samuel's hidden savings. Heard you're heading up to the McKenna place, Henderson said, lowering his voice. You be careful up there. Mountains can be treacherous, especially for a woman alone. I won't be alone, Martha replied steadily. No, Henderson agreed, something unreadable in his eyes. That's what worries some folks. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with a group of women from the church auxiliary, the same women who had crossed the street to avoid her for months. Now they blocked her path, their faces pinched with disapproval. Mrs. Caldwell, their leader, Agnes Morrison, Jack's wife, said with false sweetness, "We've come to offer you Christian counsel in your time of confusion." "I'm not confused," Martha said, trying to step around them. "Surely you must see how this appears?" Agnes continued, "A widow, barely 6 months bereaved, running off with a man who's practically a stranger. What would your poor husband think?" The cruelty of the comment took Martha's breath away. "Samuel would want me to survive," she said quietly. "He'd want me to be safe." "Safe?" Agnes laughed, a sharp sound like breaking glass. With a man who has blood on his hands? Everyone knows what happened to his brother, how Jacob McKenna brought violence to this valley. And now he's taking you to that God-forsaken ranch where no one will hear you if you need help. The only help I've needed these past months was from people like you, Martha shot back. Anger overcoming discretion. Where was your Christian charity when I was alone and grieving? Where were your offers of assistance when I could barely afford food? The women drew back as if slapped. Agnes's face flushed red. We don't associate with saloon women, she hissed. And now you're proving exactly what kind of creature you are, selling yourself to the first man who— That's enough. The voice came from behind Martha. She turned to find Jacob standing there, his presence filling the doorway. He'd cleaned up for their journey, his dark coat brushed and his boots polished. But there was something dangerous in his stance that made the church women step backward. Ladies, he said with mock courtesy, touching the brim of his hat. I believe Mrs. Caldwell has business to attend to. This is a matter for decent women to discuss, Agnes began. But Jacob cut her off. There's nothing decent about a pack of harpies tormenting a widow, he said coldly. Now move aside, or I'll move you myself. The women scattered like chickens, Agnes cluttering about summoning the sheriff. Jacob offered Martha his arm, and she took it gratefully, allowing him to escort her from the store. Thank you, she said once they were outside. Again, those biddies have nothing better to do than make others miserable. Jacob said, pay them no mind. But Martha could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the street for threats. The confrontation had reminded them both that leaving Cedar Ridge was about more than just escape. It was about survival. They'd agreed to meet at the livery stable at noon, but when they arrived, a crowd had gathered. Deputy Shaw stood with several armed men, including some Martha recognized as regulars from the saloon's poker tables. Jack Morrison was there too, a satisfied smirk on his face. Heading out, McKenna, Shaw called as they approached. Funny thing, we just got word that Ben Harlan's been asking about you. Seems he's put a bounty on your head. Something about unfinished business from that range war. Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. That's between Harlan and me, he said evenly. Maybe so. Shaw agreed. But it becomes the town's business when you're harboring our citizens. What happens to Mrs. Caldwell if Harlan's boys come calling at your ranch? I can protect her better than this town ever did, Jacob replied. Protect her or use her as bait, one of the men called out. Everyone knows Harlan likes to hit a man where it hurts most. Sure, convenient. You finding yourself a woman right when he's sniffing around? The accusation hung in the air like poison. Martha felt Jacob tense beside her, and for a moment she wondered, was there truth in those words? Had she been foolish to trust him? But then she remembered his kindness during the storm, the way he'd kept watch all night, the key he'd given her. Whatever his faults, Jacob McKenna was not a man who would use a woman as a shield. Mr. McKenna has offered me honest employment, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. Which is more than any of you did. If Ben Harlan wants to cause trouble, he'll do it whether I'm here or at the ranch. At least there I'll have a man willing to stand between me and danger. You tell him, honey, a woman's voice called out. Martha turned to see Big Sally, one of the saloon girls, pushing through the crowd. Several other women from the Silver Dollar followed her, their painted faces defiant. Martha's one of us, Sally declared, planting her hands on her hips. She sang for us, cried with us when times were hard. You high and mighty folks want to judge her for trying to make a better life? Then you'd best judge us all. The solidarity from these women, the one society deemed beyond redemption, brought tears to Martha's eyes. She'd held herself apart from them when she was Samuel's wife, trying to maintain respectability. Now she saw how false those divisions were. Get on out of here, Sally told her warmly. Find your happiness, girl. Lord knows it's scarce enough in this world. Jacob had already loaded Martha's few possessions onto his wagon. Now he helped her up onto the seat, his hands gentle but strong. As he took his place beside her and gathered the reins, Sheriff Coleman himself appeared, having been summoned by the commotion. "McKenna," the sheriff said, his weathered face grave. "I've got no cause to stop you leaving, but I'll tell you plain, if Harlan's gunning for you, bringing a woman into it makes you both targets." "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff," Jacob said. "But I've been a target for 3 years. At least now I've got a reason to be careful." The sheriff stepped back, and Jacob clicked to the horses. The wagon rolled forward, the crowd parting reluctantly. Martha kept her eyes straight ahead, though she could feel the weight of their stares, hear the whispers that followed in their wake. As they reached the edge of town, she turned for one last look at Cedar Ridge. The buildings looked small and mean in the afternoon light, the mountains rising beyond them like a promise or a threat. She could see the Silver Dollar Saloon, the window of her little room where she'd locked herself away from the world. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she'd stood there, vowing never to let anyone in again. "No regrets?" Jacob asked, following her gaze. "None," Martha said firmly, turning to face the road ahead. "Whatever comes, it can't be worse than slowly dying in that room." The road to the mountains was rough, barely more than a track in places. Jacob handled the team expertly, navigating rocks and ruts with practiced ease. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder but cleaner, scented with pine and snow. The town fell away behind them, hidden by bends in the road and stands of evergreens. They traveled in companionable silence for a while, each lost in thought. Martha found herself studying Jacob's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his scar caught the light, the competent way he managed the horses. He was a mystery still, this man who'd offered her sanctuary, but she sensed a fundamental decency in him that all of Morrison's insinuations couldn't shake. "Tell me about Ben Harlan," she said eventually. "If I'm to be in danger because of him, I should know why." Jacob's hands tightened on the reins. "Harlan owns the biggest spread in the next valley. Started buying up land about 5 years ago, forcing out the small ranchers one way or another. When Thomas and I wouldn't sell, he decided to take what he wanted anyway. The water rights." Martha remembered. "The stream that feeds my land comes from a spring on what used to be our property line. Harlan claimed the spring was on his side, tried to dam it up, divert the water. We fought it in court, even won, but Harlan doesn't accept defeat easily." Jacob's voice had gone flat, emotionless, but Martha could see the pain in the rigid set of his shoulders. "He sent men to tear down the dam one night. Thomas and I were waiting. There was a fight. I took a bullet. He touched his scar unconsciously. And Thomas was running to help me when Harlan shot him in the back. Claimed it was self-defense. That Thomas was going for a gun. He wasn't. He was 18 years old and trying to save his brother." "I'm sorry," Martha said softly, the words inadequate but necessary. "The law said there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. Harlan had witnesses, his own men, of course. I had nothing but my word and a dead brother." Jacob's laugh was bitter. "So I took what justice I could, burned Harlan's dam, ran off his cattle when they strayed onto my land, made myself enough of a nuisance that he backed off. But men like him don't forget, and now he thinks you've gotten comfortable," Martha finished. "Found a weakness he can exploit." Jacob glanced at her, surprised by her understanding. "I shouldn't have involved you in this. If you want to go back—" "I've made my choice," Martha interrupted. "Besides, you're not the only one with enemies. Morrison and his crowd won't forget that I defied them. We're both outcasts now. Jacob, might as well face what comes together." The sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks when they finally turned onto Jacob's property. Martha gasped as the vista opened before them, rolling meadows dotted with cattle, a crystal-clear stream winding through stands of aspen and pine, and in the distance, a sturdy log house with smoke rising from its chimney. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's home," Jacob said simply, but she could hear the pride in his voice. As they approached the house, Martha noticed the defensive positions, clear lines of sight in all directions. shutters that could be barred, a well positioned where someone could reach it even under fire. This was the home of a man who'd learned to expect trouble. But there was beauty too. A garden plot waiting for spring, a porch that would catch the morning sun, wildflowers growing along the fence posts. It was a place that had known love as well as loss. Jacob helped her down from the wagon, and for a moment they stood together, looking at the house that would be her refuge. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, wild and free. "Welcome to the Double J Ranch," Jacob said. "It's not much, but it's perfect," Martha said, and meant it. After months of suffocating in that tiny room, surrounded by judgment and whispers, this vast openness felt like salvation. As Jacob began unloading her belongings, Martha noticed movement near the barn. A man emerged, grizzled and bent, walking with a pronounced limp. "That's old Pete," Jacob explained. "He helps with the cattle, fought with my father in the Mexican War. He's a good man, keeps to himself mostly." Pete approached, eyeing Martha with curiosity but no judgment. "Ma'am," he said, touching his battered hat. "Jacob said we'd be having a housekeeper. Be nice to have decent cooking again. This one burns water," he added, jerking his thumb at Jacob. Despite everything, Martha found herself smiling. "I'll do my best, Mr. Just Pete, ma'am. Old Pete, if you need to distinguish me from all the young Petes around here." His eyes twinkled with humor. "Which there ain't none, so just Pete works fine." As the men carried her things inside, Martha stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. She'd left Cedar Ridge as a scandal, whispered about and scorned. But here, she was just the housekeeper, with a job to do and a roof over her head. It was a new beginning, bought with courage and desperation in equal measure. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and pine. Winter wasn't done with them yet, and somewhere out there, Ben Harlan was planning his next move. But for tonight, Martha Caldwell was safe, 5 miles from town and a world away from the woman who'd locked her door against life. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but she would meet them with open eyes and, perhaps, an open heart. The crack of rifle fire shattered the peaceful morning like glass. Martha dropped the bucket she'd been carrying, water splashing across the porch boards as she instinctively ducked. From the barn, she heard Jacob shouting orders to old Pete. Then the thunder of hooves as riders appeared on the ridge above the ranch. 6 men, their faces covered with bandanas, spread out in a semicircle. The lead rider, broad-shouldered and sitting his horse with arrogant confidence, pulled down his mask to reveal a face Martha had never seen but immediately recognized from Jacob's description. Ben Harlan. "McKenna," Harlan's voice carried across the yard like a whip crack. "Time to settle old debts." Jacob emerged from the barn, his rifle held steady but not yet aimed. Martha could see the tension in every line of his body, the way his scar stood out white against his sun-darkened skin. "This is between you and me. Harlan, send your men away." Harlan laughed, an ugly sound. "Now why would I do that? You didn't give my brother a fair chance when you burned him out 3 years ago." "Your brother was rustling my cattle," Jacob replied evenly. "And I didn't kill him, just sent him packing. Same difference. He died in Abilene 6 months later, killed in a bar fight he wouldn't have been in if you hadn't ruined him." Harlan's eyes swept the ranch, landing on Martha. Well, heard you'd found yourself a woman, the saloon widow, isn't it? My, McKenna. You always did have unusual tastes." Martha felt her cheeks burn but kept her chin high. She'd faced worse insults in Cedar Ridge, but she saw Jacob's knuckles whiten on his rifle stock, saw the dangerous shift in his stance. "Careful, Harlan," he warned. "Or what? You'll shoot me in front of your lady. That would be poor manners." Harlan gestured to his men. "Boys, why don't you have a look around? See what McKenna's been building up here while we've been patient." 2 riders broke off, heading toward the barn. Jacob raised his rifle then, the movement smooth and practiced. "Call them back." "I don't think so." Harlan drew his own weapon. not quite pointing it at Jacob. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over the water rights to that spring, legal and proper. Then you're going to pack up and leave. Take your saloon woman with you. Start fresh somewhere else. And if I refuse?" Harlan's smile was cold. "Well, accidents happen on these isolated ranches. Fires start, cattle disappear. Women find themselves alone and unprotected." His gaze lingered on Martha in a way that made her skin crawl. "Shame if something happened to your pretty songbird." The crack of a rifle from an unexpected direction made everyone freeze. Old Pete stood at the corner of the house, his ancient Springfield aimed at Harlan's chest. "That's about enough of that talk," the old man said calmly. "Mrs. Caldwell's a lady, and you'll speak of her with respect or not at all." The tension ratcheted higher. 6 guns now drawn or half drawn. Violence hanging in the air like smoke. Martha's mind raced, knowing that if shooting started, they were outnumbered 2-1. Her eyes searched for cover, for anything that might help, and landed on the dinner bell hanging from the porch post, moving slowly, trying not to draw attention. She edged toward it. If she could ring it, the sound would carry for miles, though whether help would come in time was another question. "This is touching," Harlan said, his voice tight with controlled fury. The cripple, the killer, and the whore making their last stand, like something out of a dime novel. Jacob moved then, so fast Martha barely saw it. His rifle swung up, and he fired. Not at Harlan, but at the rope holding a heavy timber above the barn door. It crashed down, spooking the horses of the 2 men who'd been approaching. One rider was thrown, hitting the ground hard and lying still. In the chaos that followed, Martha lunged for the bell, ringing it with all her strength. The clear, bronze voice pealed across the valley, again and again, a clarion call that seemed to freeze the combatants. "That's the trouble bell." Harlan snarled. "Who's going to come? You don't have any friends left. McKenna." But he was wrong. Within minutes, Martha saw dust rising from the direction of town, not just one rider, but several. As they drew closer, she recognized Sheriff Coleman in the lead. With him, 3 other men, including, surprisingly, Henderson from the general store. "Stand down, all of you," the sheriff commanded, his authority backed by the badge on his chest and the scattergun in his hands. "Harlan, what's the meaning of this?" "Private business." "Sheriff," Harlan replied, but some of his confidence had evaporated. "Armed men threatening citizens isn't private business," Coleman said firmly. "It's a breach of the peace, and I won't have it, not in my jurisdiction." "Since when do you care what happens to McKenna?" Harlan demanded. "Since I got a wire from the federal marshal in Denver," the sheriff replied. "Seems they're very interested in your land dealings. Harlan, something about forged deeds and intimidation of witnesses. Marshal's on his way. Should be here within the week." The color drained from Harlan's face. "You're bluffing." Coleman reached into his vest pocket, producing a telegram. "Care to read it yourself? Turns out that brother of yours was wanted in 3 territories for fraud. Makes a man wonder what else might turn up if they start digging into your operations." Martha saw the calculations in Harlan's eyes, the realization that his position had suddenly become precarious. Whatever evidence had prompted federal interest, it had changed the game entirely. "This isn't over," Harlan said finally, holstering his weapon. "Water rights are still mine by law." "Funny thing about that," Henderson spoke up. "Been going through some old records for the federal boys. Found the original survey from '68. That springs clearly on McKenna land. Always has been. The surveyor's notes are quite specific." Harlan's face twisted with rage, but he was trapped. With the sheriff and witnesses present, any violence would bring the full weight of the law down on him. "Mount up," he snarled at his men. The one who'd fallen was helped onto his horse, dazed but mobile. As they prepared to leave, Harlan locked eyes with Jacob. "You haven't won. I've got influence, money, time. That marshal will come and go, and I'll still be here. And one day, when you least expect it—" "I'll be waiting," Jacob replied quietly. "Just like I always have been." The riders wheeled and galloped away, dust rising in their wake. Only when they disappeared over the ridge did Martha realize she was still gripping the bell rope, her knuckles white with strain. Sheriff Coleman dismounted, approaching Jacob with a mixture of respect and wariness. "That federal marshal really is coming," he said. "Your brother's death is one of several they're looking into. Seems Harlan's been busy all over the territory." "Why now?" Jacob asked. "It's been 3 years. Sometimes the wheels of justice turn slow," Coleman replied. "But they do turn. That, and someone in Denver's been pushing for an investigation. Someone with connections." Martha caught the significant look the sheriff gave her and suddenly understood. Samuel. Her late husband's questions about irregularities, his interest in the town's business. He must have documented more than she'd known, sent information to authorities beyond Cedar Ridge's corrupt reach. "Samuel," she breathed. "He was gathering evidence." Coleman nodded. "Found some papers in his things after he died. Didn't make much sense then, but when combined with other complaints, well, it painted a picture. Your husband was a brave man. Mrs. Caldwell. His work might just bring Harlan down." Tears stung Martha's eyes. Samuel's death hadn't been for nothing, even from beyond the grave. Her gentle, thoughtful husband was fighting for justice. As the sheriff and his men prepared to leave, Henderson lingered. "That was quick thinking with the bell, ma'am," he said to Martha. "And McKenna, that shot with the timber, impressive. Though I wonder if you knew Jim Paulson was under it." "I knew," Jacob said simply. "Also knew it would knock him silly but not kill him. I'm not Harlan. I don't shoot men who can't shoot back." After they'd gone, a strange quiet settled over the ranch. Old Pete limped off to check the cattle, muttering about his joints and the excitement being too much for an old soldier. Martha and Jacob stood alone in the yard, the morning sun warm on their faces. "You saved us," Jacob said quietly. "That bell, I'd never have thought of it." "We saved each other," Martha corrected. "That's what partners do." The word hung between them, loaded with possibility. Partners, not employer and housekeeper, not protector and protected, but equals facing danger together. "Martha," Jacob began, then stopped, struggling for words. "What the sheriff said about your husband, he was a good man," Martha said softly. "He saw injustice and tried to fix it, even knowing the risk. I'm glad his work will count for something." She looked up at Jacob. "But he's gone, and I'm here. We both have to live with our ghosts, but maybe we don't have to live only with them." Jacob's hand found hers, calloused and strong. "Harlan won't give up. Even with federal attention, he'll find ways to strike at us. Then we'll be ready," Martha said firmly. "I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. This is my home now too, and I'll fight for it." The sound of approaching hooves made them both tense again, but it was only a single rider, a young man in cavalry uniform, bearing official-looking documents. "Mr. McKenna, I'm from Fort Lyon, Marshall's advance party. We'll be setting up protection for witnesses until the investigation's complete. You and Mrs. Caldwell are under federal protection as of now." As the implications sank in, safety, justice, a chance for a future without constant fear, Martha felt something ease in her chest. The danger wasn't over, might never be entirely over, but they weren't alone anymore. That evening, as she prepared supper in the ranch kitchen, a meal old Pete declared finally fit for human consumption. Martha found herself humming. It was the first time music had come naturally to her since Samuel's death. Jacob, cleaning his rifle at the table, looked up with wonder. "Don't stop," he said softly. "Please." So she didn't. She sang as she cooked, old songs and new, filling the house with melody. Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Federal guards patrolled the property, keeping watch, and inside, 2 wounded souls began to discover that perhaps they could heal after all, that love might bloom even in the shadow of violence and loss. The knock that had shattered every rule Martha kept had led to this, a new life, a new fight, and maybe, just maybe, a new love. As her voice rose in song, Jacob's eyes met hers across the kitchen, and she saw in them the same hope that filled her own heart. They'd faced down guns and threats, but this quiet moment of connection required its own kind of courage. Tomorrow would bring the federal marshal, testimonies, the machinery of justice grinding into motion. But tonight, there was music and warmth, safety and companionship. It was enough. It was everything. The makeshift courtroom in Cedar Ridge's town hall buzzed with tension as thick as the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. Martha sat beside Jacob on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching as Federal Marshal William Crenshaw prepared to begin the proceedings. The marshal was a stern man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Ben Harlan sat across the aisle, flanked by an expensive lawyer from Denver, despite his current predicament. Harlan's expression remained arrogant, though Martha noticed the way his fingers drummed nervously against his thigh. Behind them, the hall was packed with townspeople, some come to see justice done, others merely drawn by the spectacle. "This hearing," Marshal Crenshaw began, his voice cutting through the whispers, "is to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to charge Mr. Benjamin Harlan with fraud, intimidation, and murder in the death of Thomas McKenna, among other crimes." Jacob's hand found Martha's, squeezing gently. She could feel the tremor in his grip, knew what this moment meant to him. 3 years of waiting, of living with the knowledge that his brother's killer walked free. It all came down to this. The first witness was Henderson, who produced survey records and land documents dating back 20 years. His testimony was dry but damning, showing a clear pattern of forged deeds and manipulated boundaries that always benefited Harlan's growing empire. "These original documents," Henderson explained, pointing to a yellowed map, "clearly show the spring in question on the McKenna property. This later survey, supposedly done in 1879, moves the boundary. But I've found evidence that the surveyor who allegedly signed this document died in 1877. Harlan's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the marshal overruled him each time. The evidence was clear. Harlan had systematically stolen land through forgery and intimidation. Next came witnesses Martha had never expected to see. Cowboys who'd worked for Harlan, now willing to testify about the violent tactics they'd been ordered to use. One young man, barely out of his teens, described the night Thomas McKenna died. "Mr. Harlan told us to provoke a fight," the cowboy said, his voice shaking. "Said to make sure the younger McKenna drew first, so it'd look like self-defense. But Tom McKenna never went for his gun. He was running to help his brother when Mr. Harlan shot him in the back, then told us all what we'd seen if we wanted to keep breathing." The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Sheriff Coleman had to call for order twice before quiet was restored. Martha felt Jacob's entire body go rigid beside her, his breathing shallow and controlled. She knew he was fighting every instinct that told him to leap across the aisle and take his own justice. When it came time for Jacob to testify, he stood slowly, his movements deliberate. As he took the witness chair, the afternoon light caught his scar, a permanent reminder of that night. His testimony was clear and unflinching, describing the events that had led to his brother's death. "Thomas was 18, Jacob said, his voice steady despite the emotion Martha could see in his eyes. "He believed in the law, in doing things the right way, even when Harlan's men poisoned our water, killed our cattle. Thomas insisted we fight back through legal channels. He died believing justice would prevail." "And you, Mr. McKenna?" Marshal Crenshaw asked. "What did you believe?" Jacob was quiet for a moment. "I believed in revenge," he admitted. "For 3 years, that's all that kept me going, but—" His eyes found Martha in the crowd. "Recently, I've been reminded that there's more to life than hate, that maybe Thomas was right about justice, even if it comes slow." Harlan's lawyer tried to paint Jacob as a violent man seeking to frame his client, but the strategy fell apart when the marshal produced a surprise: Samuel Caldwell's journal, retrieved from a hidden spot Martha hadn't known about. Sheriff Coleman had found it while investigating Samuel's effects more thoroughly. Martha gasped as Marshal Crenshaw read excerpts in Samuel's careful handwriting, detailing suspicious transactions, intimidation tactics, and connections between Harlan and various illegal activities. Her husband had been building a comprehensive case, gathering evidence with the patience of a man who understood that rushing would only get him killed. Seems Mr. Caldwell sent copies of this information to federal authorities months before his death, the marshal said. His murder, initially dismissed as a robbery, now appears quite different in light of what he discovered. Martha stood on shaking legs when called to testify. She spoke of Samuel's concerns, his late nights poring over documents, his growing certainty that Harlan was at the center of a web of corruption that extended far beyond Cedar Ridge. "Did your husband ever mention being threatened?" Marshal Crenshaw asked. "Not directly," Martha replied, "but he became more careful in his final weeks, started hiding his work, varying his routines. He knew he was in danger." "And you, Mrs. Caldwell, have you been threatened?" Martha's gaze went to Harlan, who stared back with naked hostility. "Mr. Harlan made his intentions clear when he came to the ranch. He threatened both Mr. McKenna and myself." The final testimony came from an unexpected source, Jack Morrison, the saloon owner, sweating profusely. He admitted to being paid by Harlan to provide information and assistance in various schemes, including arranging for certain people to be in certain places at convenient times. "The night Sam Caldwell died," Morrison said, avoiding everyone's gaze, "I was told to keep him at the saloon late, make sure he won big at the tables so he'd have money worth stealing. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know they meant to kill him." The revelation sent another shock through the crowd. Martha felt a cold fury rise in her chest. Morrison had served Samuel drinks that night, congratulated him on his winnings, all while knowing he was sending a good man to his death. As the testimony concluded, Marshal Crenshaw called a recess to review the evidence. The crowd filed out slowly, buzzing with discussion. Martha and Jacob found themselves in the small room set aside for witnesses, finally alone. "Your husband was a brave man," Jacob said quietly. "Braver than I gave him credit for." "He was trying to make things right," Martha replied, tears stinging her eyes. "In his quiet way, he was fighting just as hard as you were, and he succeeded." Jacob said, "Harlan's going to pay for what he's done, for Thomas, for Samuel, for all of it." When court reconvened, Marshal Crenshaw's judgment was swift and decisive. "Based on the evidence presented, I find more than sufficient grounds to charge Benjamin Harlan with multiple counts of fraud, intimidation, conspiracy, and murder. He will be held without bail pending federal trial." Harlan erupted, shouting threats even as deputies moved to restrain him. "This isn't over. McKenna, you think you've won? I've got friends. Influence. Mr. Harlan." The marshal interrupted coldly. "I'd advise you to be quiet. Every threat you make will be added to the charges against you." As Harlan was led away in shackles, his final look at Martha and Jacob promised vengeance. But it was an empty threat now. His empire was crumbling, his men scattered, his influence broken by the weight of federal authority. Outside the town hall, the afternoon sun seemed brighter somehow. Townspeople who had avoided Martha for months now approached with congratulations and apologies. She accepted them graciously, but felt disconnected from it all. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back Samuel or Thomas. "Come on," Jacob said softly, guiding her away from the crowd. "Let's go home." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them processing the day's events. As they crested the final hill and the ranch house came into view, Martha was surprised to see smoke rising from the chimney and horses in the corral. Old Pete met them at the door, grinning broadly. "Figured you'd want a proper welcome home," he said. "Got some neighbors here who want to pay their respects." Inside, Martha found a gathering of ranchers and their wives, people who had been too frightened of Harlan to show support before. Now they filled the house with warmth and chatter, bringing food and congratulations. "We should have stood by you years ago," one grizzled rancher told Jacob, shaking his hand firmly. "Fear makes cowards of us all, but that's done now. You need anything, you just holler." As the evening wore on, Martha found herself in the kitchen with several of the rancher's wives, women who treated her simply as Jacob's housekeeper, without judgment or speculation. The scandal that had defined her in town seemed not to matter here, where survival and hard work counted more than past associations. "You've made a real difference to him," one woman said quietly, nodding toward where Jacob stood with the men. "Haven't seen him this easy in years. That boy carried his grief like a millstone." Martha watched Jacob, saw the way the tension had finally left his shoulders, how his rare smile came more readily. He caught her eye across the room and raised his glass slightly in a private toast. She felt warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the crowded kitchen. As the guests finally departed and quiet settled over the ranch, Martha and Jacob found themselves on the porch, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Old Pete had tactfully retired to his quarters, leaving them alone. "It's over," Jacob said, wonder in his voice. "Really over. Thomas can rest now." "Samuel, too," Martha added softly. "They both fought for justice in their own ways." Jacob turned to her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Martha, I need to say something. When I offered you this job, I told myself it was just practical. But somewhere between that first night and now, things changed. You've brought life back to this place, to me. I know it's too soon, that you're still grieving, but—" Martha stopped him with a gentle touch to his lips. "I know," she said. "I feel it too. Samuel would want me to be happy, to live fully, and Jacob, you make me feel alive again." He caught her hand, pressing it to his scarred cheek. "I'm not an easy man. I've got too many shadows, too much anger still." "And I'm a scandal-touched widow with a past that won't disappear," Martha replied. "But maybe two broken people can build something whole together." In answer, Jacob drew her close, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle yet full of promise. It spoke of new beginnings, of love born from shared loss and mutual courage. When they parted, Martha saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since that night you opened your door in the storm. And I love you," Martha replied, the words feeling right and true, not for saving me, but for seeing me as worth saving. They stood together on the porch, arms around each other, looking out over the land that had been won through sacrifice and perseverance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the federal trial, rebuilding what Harlan had destroyed, the ongoing work of the ranch. But tonight, they had each other and the promise of a future neither had dared imagine. In the distance, a nightbird began to sing, its melody carrying across the valley. Martha found herself humming along, and Jacob held her tighter, swaying slightly to the rhythm. The woman who had locked her door against the world had found the courage to open it, and in doing so, had discovered that love could bloom even in the harshest ground. The stars wheeled overhead, constant and eternal, bearing witness to this quiet moment of triumph. Justice had been served, the past honored, and the future beckoned with all its uncertain glory. And Martha Caldwell, who had once thought her life over, sang softly in the arms of the man she loved, her voice rising pure and true into the vastness of the western night. Spring arrived in the mountains like a benediction, melting the snow and awakening the dormant earth. Martha stood at the kitchen window of the ranch house, watching the meadows burst into bloom with wild columbine and Indian paintbrush. 6 months had passed since the trial that sent Ben Harlan to federal prison. 6 months of healing and rebuilding. The morning sun caught her wedding ring, a new one, simple silver that Jacob had crafted himself from Mexican coins. They'd married quietly 3 weeks ago, with only old Pete and Sheriff Coleman as witnesses. It wasn't the grand ceremony she'd had with Samuel, but it felt more real, more honest, two people who'd seen the worst of life choosing to face the future together. Admiring the view, "Mrs. McKenna?" Jacob's arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Always," she replied, leaning back into his warmth. "Though I was thinking we might plant a proper garden this year, vegetables, herbs, maybe some roses by the porch. Whatever you want," he murmured against her hair. "This is your home now," truly and completely. Through the window, they could see riders approaching, neighbors coming to help with the spring roundup. What had once been a solitary task for Jacob and old Pete had become a community effort. The isolation that had defined the ranch for years was gone, replaced by the steady stream of visitors and friends. "I should start breakfast," Martha said. "They'll be hungry when they arrive." But Jacob held her a moment longer. "Martha, there's something I need to tell you. I got a letter yesterday from the federal prosecutor. Harlan's been sentenced, 20 years hard labor. He won't trouble us again." Martha felt the last knot of tension she'd been carrying dissolve. "It's truly over then?" "The past is." Jacob agreed. "The future's just beginning." As Martha prepared breakfast, she found herself humming, then singing outright. Her voice filled the kitchen, spilling out through the open windows into the spring morning. The men arriving for the roundup paused to listen, smiles on their weathered faces. Music had returned to Martha's life, no longer a source of shame but a gift to be shared. The day was full of work and laughter. Martha had never imagined herself as a rancher's wife, but she'd taken to it with surprising ease. She could rope a calf now, mend fence, and read the weather signs in the clouds. More importantly, she'd found her place in this community of strong women who worked alongside their men and weren't afraid of hard living. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the work was done. The neighbors departed with promises to return for the barn dance Martha was planning for midsummer. Old Pete grumbled good-naturedly about all the social affairs, but secretly loved the activity. That evening, Martha and Jacob sat on the porch they'd expanded, watching the stars emerge. The night was warm enough that she needed only a light shawl, and the air was sweet with the scent of blooming sage. "I've been thinking," Martha said, "about that back room at the saloon where I used to live." Jacob looked at her with concern. "What about it?" "Morrison's gone, run out of town after the trial. The new owner is looking for someone to run a proper restaurant in that space. Respectable food. Maybe some music in the evenings." She paused, gathering courage. "I thought maybe I could help set it up. Not to work there, but to help other women who might need what I needed. A chance to start over, to use their talents without shame." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, and Martha worried she'd asked too much. Then he took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I think that's a fine idea," he said. "You know what it's like to be trapped, to need a door to open. Maybe you can be that door for others." Martha's heart swelled with love for this man who understood her so completely. "The saloon widow who locked her door," she murmured, remembering that desperate woman she'd been. "I was so afraid to let anyone in." "And now?" Jacob asked softly. "Now I know that sometimes the thing we fear most is exactly what we need." She turned to face him fully. "That knock that shattered every rule I'd made. It saved my life." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other, their wild song a reminder of the untamed land that surrounded their small sphere of civilization. But here on the porch, with lamplight spilling golden from the windows and the man she loved beside her, Martha felt perfectly safe. "Sing for me," Jacob requested, as he often did in the evenings. "That song you were humming when I first heard you." Martha smiled and began to sing, her voice rising clear and true into the vast western sky. It was a song of sorrow transformed to joy, of love found in unexpected places, of new beginnings carved from the ruins of the past. As she sang, Jacob's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining, two people who had locked their doors against the world, now open to all the possibilities that love could bring. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to their journey from loneliness to love, from isolation to community, from despair to hope. And Martha McKenna, who had once been the saloon widow locked away from life, sang with the freedom of a woman who had found her home at last. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love and redemption in the Wild West. I'm curious, Where are you enjoying this tale? Are you driving through the countryside, relaxing at home, or perhaps on a long journey? Please leave a comment below to let me know where in the world Martha and Jacob's story is reaching you. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories of frontier romance and courage. And share your thoughts about this journey from loneliness to love. Your comments and engagement mean the world to us.